Hello everybody, CVH here, and in today's video I'd like to talk about some potential changes to the Elder Scrolls Legends. Before I go into anything, I would just like to say right off the bat that none of these are confirmed. There's nothing that I'm going to say that it's been like any sort of news or anything. The only thing we do have to go off of is that somewhere Maricon, one of the developers, had alluded to some potential changes upcoming in a future patch. This shouldn't really come as a surprise to anybody because we've been in, open beta for quite a while now. We still don't exactly know when the game's going to release, but, common sense would say we can expect probably another at least one patch of some balance changes. And of course, they're using the time to look at the meta, look at their own statistics that we don't have we don't have those kind of stats on, and see how the decks are performing in a much wider sample size than we would have access to. So in this particular video, I'll just be going over a few cards that I've been thinking of because I've played a lot of Legends recently, obviously, as always. And I think they've done a really good job with the nerfs and even the buffs up to this point. And I'd like to talk about some changes in cards and otherwise that I'll get into that I think would just benefit quality of life, some that you might expect, some that you might not expect. So for that, the first card I would like to go over is Crystal Tower Crafter. This might come as a surprise to a lot of you who haven't been really following my particular stream or videos, but I think Action Assassin, as an aggro assassin featuring Crystal Tower Crafter and a bunch of actions, is one of the best decks currently. And this card reminds me a lot of the pre-nerf Murkwater Savage. For those of you who weren't playing when this card was really relevant, it did used to cost 2 Magicka instead of 3 Magicka. And what happens when a card like that is so cheap, turn 2 is basically the first turn for a lot of these decks on their curve, it becomes sort of this snowball-y type effect that actually sort of sucks the fun out of the game because you have to answer the card immediately, and if you don't answer the card immediately, you probably lose to the card. And we do have the prophecy system in place. Potentially you get an early piercing javelin or an early silence or something that you can use to mitigate those threats, but a lot of the time it just becomes too much and you lose the game to it. Crystal Tower Crafter also has this problem, and it also interacts with some cards like Lesser Ward in particular that make it almost impossible to deal with immediately. So in decks like that, it's pretty common that you would actually have a turn 1, turn 2, or even turn 3 Crystal Tower Crafter with 3/3 and Ward, and after that it just gets exponentially larger as you're playing your other actions like Lightning Bolt, Slaughterfish spawning, etc. So basically the only nerf that I would really think is applicable to this card, I don't really want to make it a 3 cost like Murkwater Savage. I don't really see that it would be too playable at that point. I think making it a 2/1 would get the job done, but if you make it a 2/1 to start, at the first buff, it would become a 3/2, and then you can still Firebolt it. And we've seen, cards that are 3/3s and 4/3s, like Moonlight Werebat and House Kinsman. The nerf to 2 health is a pretty relevant nerf indeed, so giving Crystal Tower Crafter that little bit of extra time of being a 2 health creature to trade into 2/2s and 2/1s and Firebolt, etc., I think that would be a good change. A lot of the time when you're playing Crystal Tower Crafter, your opponent is happy to just ring of Magicka into a Lightning Bolt against it, and the fact that it sucks up so much premium removal so often, I already mentioned Piercing Javelin even, the fact that it sucks up so much premium removal so often and sets you so far ahead on tempo and in the life at an early point in the game, even if you're not necessarily using it to close out the game if it's been removed at a later turn, it snowballs so hard that I think it just requires some sort of nerf to the card. And of course, you still have these insane Lesser Ward and other kinds of starts that are hard to answer. The card still has snowball potential if you make it a 2/1. It just has that many more answers sometimes. Of course, it'll still be a fantastic card, I think. So moving on to another card in the same attribute but a totally different side of the curve is Supreme Atromancer. So this card is well known as a centerpiece of the Merrick Battle Mage decks, which if you're not familiar with those decks, they actually use Supreme Atromancer more than Merrick as a win condition, possibly because Supreme Atromancer can be used as a 3-of in a deck, and Merrick is a unique legendary. Which brings me to my first point, that if this card was a unique legendary, I think it would probably be fine. It would be the power level I think I would expect, and I think it would be pretty reasonable. But I don't think they can just make non-unique legendaries into unique legendaries, although that would be my first idea. If it were possible, I think that would be fine, but if not, we can think about other changes as well. But that deck basically uses cards like Raiding Party and Markarth Bannerman to make a bunch of 0-cost Nord Firebrands, and then kills the opponent with them over the course of usually 1 turn with a Merrick or a Supreme Atromancer to deal a bunch of 2 damage pings to your opponent. Supreme Atromancer by itself is already a pretty powerful card, deals 4 immediately, and really gets you ahead on the board. This is one of the best cards against Ram Scout in particular because aside from a very, very select few cards, there are no 1-card answers to it. It's also worth noting that the second Supreme Atromancer, even by itself, if you retain the first 3/3 Supreme Atromancer on the board, the second one will deal 10 damage immediately, and of course, in the Merrick Battle Mage decks with a bunch of those Nord Firebrands, that can represent an obscene amount of burst damage against those control decks. So basically, I like where the card is in that I like that there is a late-game answer for these combo-oriented, tempo-oriented, or even control decks that want an answer to other control decks. I like that it punishes Ram Scout in the way that it does. It's one of the best late-game answers to it, and you shouldn't always have to win the game super fast against Ram Scout in order to compete. There should be those late-game bombs that are even hard for some control decks to deal with. So with my nerf, I would like to keep that part of it in check, and I don't think a stat change really does the nerf any justice, because the problem of it is the burst damage, right? If you retain the burst damage but you make this Supreme Atromancer a 3/2, that doesn't really change much because, again, you're going to get all the burst damage immediately when you play Supreme Atromancer and then play those zero-cost Nords, and that's really the uninteractive part of it. So what I think I would probably do is just change the amount of damage it deals. Obviously, Supreme Atromancer is an upgraded form of Expert Atromancer, which deals no damage but still summons the 2/5/3s. And I think, like I said, changing the stats doesn't really do anything substantial to the card at all. So I think I would keep everything the same, except maybe think about reducing the damage it deals to 1. Right now, we can sort of compare the card to Swindler's Market. Swindler's Market, of course, deals 1 damage whenever you play a zero-cost card, and it's a support. It's kind of like Swindler's Market, but insane, because it's dealing twice as much damage, obviously. And you gotta think it's like Swindler's Market if Swindler's Market was a better card by itself, because Supreme Atromancer is a much better card by itself. You can play it and it'll be fine on board against a lot of decks. And the cards you're comboing with are better cards, because the Nord Firebrands allow you to use Markarth Bannerman, Raiding Party, and in order to play Swindler's Market in a deck, you have to have a bunch of other zero-cost cards that just aren't as good as Markarth and Raiding Party. Rarely do the Merrick Battle Mage decks actually play Nord Firebrands themselves, so the deck quality is allowed to be better than Swindler's Market, the burst damage is better, and Supreme Atromancer by itself is a fine play in a bunch of matchups. So that's one card I think I would change in that way. On the topic of some other cards that can snowball, there are 2 that come to mind, namely Daring Cutpurse and Slaughterfish Spawning. Now these are cards I don't necessarily think need to be touched too much. One thing I want to say about Daring Cutpurse is that I think maybe Prophecy could come off of it. I think it would still be a fine card. I heard some rumor that maybe it didn't have Prophecy in the very beginning of closed beta, but then it was given Prophecy later, but I think that's a lot to do with the fact that it was competing with Murkwater Savage in those times before Murkwater Savage became a 3-cost, and I don't really think that needs to be the case anymore. Slaughterfish Spawning I might get some hate for, but I really don't think the card needs to be touched, honestly. I know it's one of those cards just like Crystal Tower Crafter that can get out of hand and lead to some pretty upsetting losses when you just can't answer the Slaughterfish, but here's my thing. Again, like Supreme Atromancer, I like those cards that do punish slow decks, and I think Slaughterfish does a fine job of it. Basically, any nerf I can think to the card, including increasing the cost or decreasing the stats of the Slaughterfish, sort of makes the card unplayable. I don't think making them 0/1s is a good nerf. I think that just does too much to the card. And you gotta think, every time you play Slaughterfish Spawning, one of the Slaughterfish goes in the field lane, one of them goes in the shadow lane. And if you have anything in the field lane already, literally anything, which has more than 1 health, which you probably do, you get a favorable trade immediately. So one of the Slaughterfish dies immediately, and a lot of the time it feels like when you play Slaughterfish and you're any sort of behind in the field lane, it feels like you're just actually playing the Slaughterfish card and not the Slaughterfish Spawning. Of course, you can make the case, well, what if I don't have anything in the field lane? What if I don't have anything to answer the Slaughterfish from my hand immediately? What if I don't have my Murkwater Witch in my hand, and then I can't, ping one of the Slaughterfish and play the Witch in the other lane? What if I don't have any efficient removal or any cards I can trade in the shadow lane? Well, you probably lose. I don't think it's insane to lose to a card like that when you don't have any answers. I think it encourages making sure you have answers to those kind of cards in your deck, and I think occasionally the fact that it snowballs and wins the game is okay. Rarely do they grow that much, and you might put yourself a little bit far behind on tempo to deal with them, but I think it's a good check for control decks. I don't think it's overpowered by any stretch of the imagination personally, although I do think we can expect some nerfs to aggro decks that don't necessarily use Crystal Tower Crafter or other blue cards. I think the decks that use Slaughterfish are probably due for a nerf, and while I wouldn't personally say that this card deserves a nerf, I wouldn't be totally surprised to see it being nerfed. Basically, from my standpoint, card is fine, but I would expect maybe something happening to this card. However, I have another potential change that might impact those aggro decks in the way that Bethesda and Direwolf want to see them impacted, and it doesn't actually have to do with the cards in them at all. So the nerf I'm thinking of is to the Ring of Magicka. I know this isn't a card in the game, even though it used to actually be a support, the Elixir of Magicka. It got pseudo buffed actually to a support because now pseudo buffed from a support actually to the ring, which is just a thing on the board. Now it can't be targeted by support removal cards like Shadowfen Priest or Vicious Dreg. So now this card it does the exact same thing basically. You just click on it even though it's not a card and you get an extra Magicka for the turn. And there's been a lot of discussion recently, and basically since I've started playing the game, whether 3 charges of this, previously a support, now it's a ring, whether 3 charges of an additional Magicka is too much for the second player. And you can sort of rationalize it because it's not a card like it is in Hearthstone, it's not the coin that you can combo with certain cards, and of course the second player doesn't get an additional card. However, the case is definitely true. While I probably in the long run of stats, at least the one time they had mentioned it on Reddit, the dev said that you have a slight advantage going first as opposed to second with the now Ring of Magicka, I do think it presents too much of an advantage in particularly the aggressive versus aggressive matchups. Because whoever gets the ring in those matchups gets to play 1 turn ahead of the opponent 3 turns, and usually the first 3 turns or 3 out of the first 4 turns. And that sets you very far ahead when you're considering that those matchups both players are trying to end the game by turns 6 through 8 at the long end of things. Those are the aggro decks, the mid-range decks, mid-range archer. It's very important to get ahead on life. And when we're talking about the snowball-y cards that can lead to unfun victories, or unfun losses basically when you're staring them down, the Elixir of Magicka, now turned into the Ring of Magicka, has contributed to a fair number of those games. And I make the case a lot that when I'm playing a control deck, I actually don't really care if my opponent has the ring. A lot of times I'd rather not, because that means I'll be playing before my opponent a lot of times, because the games are going to go very long, but that's in those control versus control games. So, potential solutions. It would be pointless to complain about this without offering potential solutions. I have been talking about it recently on stream, especially when those games get decided by the Ring of Magicka. Potentially, I would like to see what would happen if we got only 2 charges on the ring, and I have to imagine this is something they've either tested in the past or continue to test now at Direwolf. What kind of games develop if you only have 2 charges of the Ring of Magicka? And I would also, this next change, I can already hear the collective cringes in the chat. Take a deep breath here. I wouldn't mind seeing what would happen if we got a sort of a Hearthstone equivalent, whereas we only get 1 charge of the Ring of Magicka going second, but we get an extra card in our opening hand. I think maybe that would be okay. Call me insane. Either way, I think the Ring of Magicka is slightly too good the way it is now, and I think, because I can't really think of too many aggro cards. I know a lot of people use Slaughterfish as an example, but I can't really think of too many cards in these aggressive decks that need to be balanced too much. I do think that there is something that might need to be done in the long run if their stats tell them to, and I think this might just be the change to do it. Because when you really think about it, the Ring of Magicka is one of the highest snowball potential cards in the game. And when you're playing a deck like Mid-Range Archer against a control deck, if you have the ring, that means you get your 2-drop on turn 1, if you aren't like being draw your Ungolem, and then you get your 3-drop on turn 2, then you just play another 3-drop on turn 3, and the 3rd charge is really what does it, because then you play the turn 4 Soul Rest Marshal, or if you're playing Mid-Range Scout, the Black Worm Necromancer, or if you're playing an aggro deck against another aggro deck, you get your Burn and Pillage, a bunch of different things. And of course, you have to take 1 turn without the Ring of Magicka. But when you consider that the first 4 turns, you're only playing behind your opponent 1 of those 4, 75% you're just ahead in a deck that's already trying to curve under your opponent. Maybe that's a bit too much. And of course, those aggro decks run out of steam eventually in the late game, but maybe the Hearthstone equivalent, where you only have 1 turn ahead, would make people think a little bit more about using it. I think at least 2 charges, that would make a lot of people try to use them more efficiently, because you wouldn't be able to do what I just said, which is, play that turn 4 Soul Rest Marshal after 2 turns of already playing ahead of your opponent in Magicka. I think maybe the 1 charge and the extra card, you'd have a little bit more steam as an aggro deck, so you wouldn't necessarily need to play ahead of your opponent too much in the first few turns, and you'd only have that 1 Ring of Magicka that you'd have to use very efficiently and smartly. And I think it would encourage a lot more foresight, because one of the first things I learned when I started playing these aggressive decks in this game is that you basically, as soon as you have a good ring, you use it, because you have 2 more. Because you'd rather use all 3 charges of the Ring of Magicka very quickly and get that far ahead of your opponent and win the game, than potentially ever lose the game with that extra 1 charge of the Ring of Magicka that you look back on the game and think, maybe I could have used this. And I think that it sort of takes a lot of the thought out of it, because they're so, you have so many charges of them that you just sort of use them, and then you're way too far ahead of your opponent, and it is very snowbally. So I think either 2 charges on the ring with no additional change, or 1 charge on the ring with an additional card for the person who goes second. I would like to see how those changes interact with the current decks in the metagame, and I'm sure that's something they might have been testing. Speaking of Soul Rest Marshal, by the way, Direwolf, I'm sure you already know of my change, but I still, even though we have a lot of aggro decks in the meta now that have punished the Soul Rest decks a good amount, I would still like to see the errata, where it can't reduce another Soul Rest Marshal in your hand, it can reduce anything else. Soul Rest into Blood Dragon, sure. Soul Rest into Cliff Racer or Leaf Lurker, sure. Soul Rest into Blood Dragon, I don't think that's a thing that should be allowed to happen. I know it doesn't decide a ton of games right now, especially because Archer is not really the most popular deck, at least as much as it was, but I do think that's a change that I would still like to see. So the final thing I'd like to discuss in this video, which has been discussed time and time again and continues to be a major talking point of the game, is the prophecy mechanic. Now, I know you guys might be surprised to hear me say this, so I'll just, reiterate once again, I don't think anything needs to really change with the prophecy system as it is. I don't think it needs to go away. I don't think we need to do some drastic thing like remove the first rune. I think it's a really well-designed system, and I will continue to say, right now, I think all of the prophecy cards that are currently released are fine. I have made the case that in the past, Moonlight Werebat was too powerful when it was a 4-3. They changed it to a 4-2. I think it's fine now. And I think there are some very, very powerful cards that are prophecies, and they are indeed especially powerful and potentially very backbreaking in the first rune, but I don't think they need to be changed. And I know they lead to some of these crazy losses where you wouldn't lose otherwise. Oh, my opponent got this first rune Dark Harvester. Why is he running that card first of all, and why is it in his first rune second of all? Why did he draw that happening, on the top of his deck? It's just like a top deck, except some decks just can't really afford to play around them too well, and that is one of the checks that we have against those really, really fast aggro decks. So I think we can't make the case that the prophecy system needs to be fundamentally changed if we want to see those aggro decks put in check. However, I do think that moving forward, some cards might be potentially, they obviously have to design these cards very, very carefully. Otherwise, we have cards that are too powerful in the first turns. So I think if there is anything to be done, and I don't think this needs to be applied to any cards that are currently in the pool, but I think a few people have suggested this change that I've seen, and I've been thinking about it as well. Maybe a Prophecy 2 or a Prophecy 3 card, which would simply, instead of Prophecy, would say Prophecy 2 or Prophecy 3, and if you have a card that says Prophecy 2, it says when you draw this card off of your rune, you can play it if it's the second. There's a better way to word this, but what I'm getting at is a Prophecy 2 card can't be triggered if you draw it off of the first rune break. But if you draw a Prophecy 2 card, when your second rune or third rune or fourth rune breaks, you can play it for free just as you would a normal Prophecy card. A 4-3 Moonlight Werebat that we used to have before the nerf, that could be a pretty decent prophecy too. You know what I'm saying? It's just a little bit more powerful than a first rune prophecy should usually be, and I don't really think anything is imbalanced to the point where it needs that change. Dark Harvester is mostly balanced by the fact that almost no deck wants to play it, for example. But if it costs a lot less, it could be a prophecy too. And I know people will always complain about prophecies and say they lead to these sort of crazy and, for a lack of a better word, BS losses. But here's the deal, that's kind of the fun in the game. Sometimes you need losses like those, and I try to pride myself on being a competitive player and trying to be the best I can be, so obviously I don't love losing like that, but it's a really feel-good thing, especially for new players, that adds some sort of craziness to the game, so games aren't always decided by what's on board. It's just something unexpected that, they create talking points. That's sort of the reason I would never say Wabbajack needs a nerf, even though it does lead to some of those crazy BS losses. In even my most recent video on the channel besides this, I got my opponent Wabbajacked into an 11-drop on a 9-drop on his turns 4 and 5, and I lost, and it was pretty crazy, and it happened on Legend Ladder, and occasionally those things happen, and prophecies happen more, but they are able to be played around to some degree by the vast majority of decks, and I think as long as they're designed with care moving forward and maybe implementing that Prophecy 2 or Prophecy 3 system, we shouldn't have much to worry about, from prophecies at least. So those are basically my thoughts. Be sure to leave a comment below with your own, I'd love to read them. Be sure to leave a like if you've enjoyed the video and check out other strategy videos and highlights on my channel. It remains to be seen whether Bethesda and Direwolf will do any of the above changes, whether they'll completely do something different. I know they usually like to buff cards as well as nerf them. We've seen some of those in the last patch. I'm pretty bad at figuring out of the vast majority of cards that aren't very good right now what needs to be buffed. I know we'd all like to see decks like Control Mage in particular get back to a little bit of their former strength. But I think my change of the Elixir and / Ring of Magicka, I still get those two mixed up, but I think the change of the Ring of Magicka that I presented is one way to give Control a little bit back, some of the edge that it lost to, especially those mid-range, those really aggressive mid-range decks. So I'd love to hear your thoughts though. Do you think these are good changes? Do you think they're bad? Do you think any other cards that I mentioned should be on the chopping block? I know a lot of you will say Slaughterfish spawning, of course. So yeah, I'm looking forward to your thoughts, and I think we're all looking forward to seeing what Direwolf and Bethesda do in the coming weeks and months. So that's all I got. Leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you guys next time.